Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Harman Carr. She's the Vice President of Artificial Intelligence at Tanium. Harman, good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
And we want to talk about one of the most important activities, let's say, in the grand scheme of cybersecurity. And in some ways, maybe it's the foundational activity, and that is taking care of and managing endpoints, because large organizations have many endpoints, multiple endpoints per user even, and some endpoints aren't even associated with a person. So give us the 50,000-foot view of what's going on in endpoint management generally, and we'll get into some of the details of AI and data and so forth.
Yeah, I think a general trend recently, especially with AI emerging, has been automation. So more and more boards are asking questions of their organizations, saying, how do you plan on implementing automation, and how do you make that a robust sort of process and minimize risk there as well? So more and more organizations are thinking about, how do we automate endpoint management? How do we figure out how do we do these kind of remedial basic tasks in a way with less resources that are available to them now?
And automation is nice, but it's not the end of itself necessarily. What are they trying to get at with automation? What's the real goal?
Yeah, it's interesting because over the years, we've have more and more tools that are telling us what's wrong with our enterprise, right? They're telling us, hey, you have this vulnerability, you're out of compliance here, and that's great. And there is a lot of data out there for that now. And now organizations are going, how do I go through every single thing and actually fix these things so I don't have holes in my organization? And that for a long time has, and today even, is a quite manual process for a lot of organizations. So that's where I think a lot of people are looking to capitalize and build automations so that these lists of long findings and open vulnerabilities that they've had for years, they want to close. And could they leverage, AI even or automation to help them do that? And if it's not just fully remediating, can it help them do a level of prioritization as well?
Right. And when we talk about endpoint management, in many ways, that itself breaks down into several components, and each of those components kind of has a logical continuing branch beyond it. I'm thinking of three that come to mind. We can talk about these. One is, as you mentioned, compliance,
Mhm.
because with CMMC coming from the Defense Department and
Right.
and reporting requirements coming across civilian and DoD, these are all compliance issues that agencies will have to have for themselves and for their vendors, for that matter, which is kind of an endpoint. Then there's vulnerability discovery itself, and then
Mhm.
there's remediation and maybe policy development over use of devices. So let's start with compliance. What are the issues there, and how can that be automated?
Yeah. The issue with compliance is one is it's always evolving. There's new kind of rules and regulations that are coming your way to actually do compliance all the time. So in terms of now, it's like, how do you actually stay in compliance is the biggest battle for organizations. So can you automate some of that process? Is a big deal. And that's what a lot of organizations are looking for.
All right. And in compliance, yeah, definitely a moving target. I guess maybe they all are in some sense.
They
Then
are.
there is the actual understanding what's happening with devices, the vulnerability detection, and so
Mhm.
on. That's really a big job because of well, you tell us what goes into being able to understand
Yeah.
what's weak or vulnerable on your devices.
There's a lot that goes into it, and it's really complex. One, the hardest thing is like correlating data, right? Or being able to have access to all the data that you need when you're actually trying to figure out, is this a real threat? So you may get a detection, something lights up and like, this looks like something I should be concerned about. But how do you validate that? That you may need to, you may need to collect information from many different sources in your organization to actually understand that. The second part of that is understanding the scope of that threat in your organization, right? Is this limited to just these four machines, or is this a broader issue, right? That requires a lot of data aggregation to be actually able to make informed decisions of how do I want to respond to this thing? Right? Do I want to limit? Is it just limited to these four machines, and I just need to address these four machines, or is this something that's across my entire organization, and I need to respond, and then I need to make a fundamental policy change in my organization that we are not exposed to this again. So there's a lot of steps and complexity in that.
Yes, and when we talk about, scope, as you mentioned, is it only these 4 machines? That gets to the environment of the devices, which is a real cybersecurity threat in itself. We've heard these stories and you know them. Some
Mhm.
people are using well, lots of people in the age of telework are using access to the VPN that's through their home Wi-Fi network from some cable or something or satellite signal coming into a house that is not part of anybody's corporate environment, or they are working in remote areas that are commercial, the proverbial coffee shop. Is that part of the data gathering and part of the, let's say, scoping out of what's going on?
Yeah. So I think historically, those endpoints that were not connected to your core network, they were just not managed. It was just like a blind spot for organizations, right? These people were sitting in coffee shops. You have no idea what they're doing on those endpoints. And now we're starting to see more and more organizations obviously adopt a model where people can even bring their own devices and they have a way to manage those, which is great. Like we were making steps in the right direction, whether you're home or you're at Starbucks. You actually have a way of enforcing some policies on these endpoints. You have a way of understanding what's happening in these on these endpoints as well. But but it does still add to the threat landscape. It still complicates that a lot more because um, they're not online like they are if they're connected to your core network, right? They're not online as often maybe as when they're connected to your core network. So there is still a level of complexity there with those types of endpoints that remains. And the biggest thing, even as an organization with Tanium, what we talk about is like you've got to be able to maintain a level of visibility on those endpoints at all times, whether they're in your core network or someone sitting at a coffee shop.
And then the third element here is remediation, which is tied closely to vulnerability. It seems like that would be a good potential for automation is from the discovery of a vulnerability to the remediation of it.
Yes, and that is sometimes the hardest part is actually doing the remediation and doing it in a time frame that actually makes sense to respond to that threat. So you have organizations sometimes, and we hear about it even on the news sometimes, is we're still remediating and it's been a month since an incident occurred, right? Even with a CrowdStrike incident, we saw organizations that were still trying to recover some days, weeks, even sometimes months later from what had happened. So remediation is a big, big part of it, and having a way to respond and actually push that remediation to your entire organization. And then the second part of the remediation is actually verified that that remediation actually do what you intended it to do. Did it actually get enforced on these endpoints, or do you just push something out and hope next time we don't get exposed to the same threat?
And I just want to take a quick detour here, maybe, and if you could,
Mhm.
the Tanium experience, what do you consider and what should be considered endpoints for the process of for the in service of the idea of automating endpoint management, I should say.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, I mean, an endpoint for organizations, the way everyone's defining it is really anything that has an IP address. Anything that's plugged into your core network has an IP address, whether it's a smart TV, a smart whiteboard, routers, switches, etc. All of those things pose a threat in your network. They pose a threat for your organization. From a Tanium context, what we're really focused on is things like workstation servers, more of your traditional endpoints with a traditional OS. And then we're expanding to also more like OT type of devices, as that's a huge risk area that has only grown for organizations over the last several years.
And just to get back to pull one more thread on the scope question, you said, is it only these few devices or could it be something that is more systemic, let's say? I guess data and data analysis and maybe a little AI applied to what's going on with those devices can tell you whether, well, no, it's just that localized thing, or could this grow into something that spreads?
Yeah.
Right?
No, absolutely. So we're actually in this is a question that we've been asking for a long time. So we have Tanium's running on millions and millions of endpoints, and using that data to help organizations understand, hey, here's a hotspot for something. And even if you think about it, just a software something simple as a software update, right? Someone's updating to the new version of Zoom or Chrome or whatever it might be. And let's say that actually creates a negative impact for an organization because it causes a lot of crashes, it causes a memory spike, and it degrades the end user's experience. How do we just proactively tell you that this change in your organization may have negative consequences associated with it? Or on the contrary, and say, hey, this is a really safe change because we've seen it happen on hundreds of thousands of machines. You should fix it because it also will help with the risk in your environment, right? It will improve risk in your environment. So that's a big thing that we've been focusing on at Tanium is how do we give you these confidence scores where they're gathered kind of data and intelligence that we've learned from millions and millions of endpoints when you're trying to make these decisions of actually making changes, understanding scope of things in your organization.
Right. So there's an advantage to the using organization from broader telemetry, let's say, than simply looking at their own network and their own endpoints.
Right, right. So I'll give you a really good example. So, going into the fall, a lot of financial institutions, a lot of retailers, what they're going to go into is basically a change freeze, right? They want to make sure their, credit card machines, that entire infrastructure for people buying, is as in the best shape it possibly can. So they minimize any change that they make to this infrastructure during this period. But that doesn't mean that threats aren't still occurring, right? Like there's still things that they will need to address. So there's a huge process that they go through to evaluate, is this risk worth taking and actually making a change to this large infrastructure that could have billions of dollars of impact. So having an input and having a data point that tells you, hey, this is a change that's occurred on, 400,000 machines, and it was really safe and it had a really good outcome, and helping them drive that decision of we should then apply this change to our organization. It will lower our risk and then obviously and also not have impact to our infrastructure and any of our operations.
All right, we've got a lot more to discuss, but right now we're going to take a short break. My guest today is Harman Carr. She's the Vice President of Artificial Intelligence at Tanium. I'm Federal Drive host here on Federal Insights, sponsored by Tanium here on Federal News Network. Welcome back to Federal Insights, sponsored by Tanium here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Harman Carr. She's the Vice President of Artificial Intelligence at Tanium. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. And before the break, Harman, you mentioned that the output of Tanium's analysis based on data gathered from millions of endpoints is a confidence index. Tell us more about what that is and to where it can apply.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're really focusing on looking at a broader picture of how changes impact endpoints. So if you think about Tanium that's running today on millions of endpoints across banking, retailers, federal, et cetera, every vertical that you can possibly think of. And what these endpoints are doing is obviously they're getting updates and changes to them constantly. And what we wanted to look at is how do we measure the impact of the changes that are occurring on those endpoints, though that organizations can make more informed decisions. So even if you think about in the context of a OS patch, right? Generally, OS patches are safe and something that every organization does and applies every single month. But every once in a while, we have that one patch that causes a lot of issues on a network. So how do we proactively tell you, hey, this is a patch that we're starting to see across all of our customers, we're starting to see on endpoints is causing some sort of impact, a negative impact on an endpoint. So that may change your calculus of, do you want to push this patch right now, or do you want to do additional testing with this patch before you push it out to your organization? We're looking at things like, are a large number of endpoints or a large number of customers uninstalling a particular patch? If they are, generally that indicates that there is an issue associated with that patch, and proactively telling other organizations to say, hey, this patch may have some issues associated with it. The other thing a lot of admins spend a lot of time chasing is after they've hit deploy all these patches to my organizations, a lot of failures. Right? They're chasing those failures for a long time, and then by that time, next month patches are available. So before you even push that button, can we just we'll just proactively tell you, hey, these endpoints are never going to get these patches. They don't even have enough disk space, right? They haven't even been rebooted to be able to be these patches to be able to apply. So being a lot more proactive about alerting and giving some sort of confidence score and index to help them gauge and make these decisions for changes.
So the confidence index is almost a fever chart that's going up and down and changing in real time.
Yeah. So these, as more and more endpoints kind of get that change, that score is changing, right? So if we start to see all of a sudden, hey, all of a sudden this is starting to cause crashes across customers because they push the latest version of, X software, we're just going to tell you, hey, confidence score is going down here.
Right. And what form does it take? I mean, as a customer, as an agency, what do I get? I don't get a telegram. Do I get something that shows up on a dashboard about this patch or that patch, or what actually happens?
Yeah. So what the way customers actually consume this data is within the Tanium console. Each change next to it will have a confidence score associated and it'll say low, moderate, or high confidence. And it additionally gives you additional context to say this is moderate confidence score. Though it's successful 98% of the time, it's actually seen that it causes some crashes. We've seen an occasion it's caused some crashes on these types of machines. So that's what's lowered our confidence associated with this. So that's how customers get that data. And then customers can use and say, hey, as long as there's a high confidence score associated with change, I want to automate just applying these to my organization. I just want to send this change up because I know it's been tested on many, many machines, and I want to start deploying that to my endpoints.
And if something is problematic, or I guess for that matter, if it is okay, these how fast can the index be delivered or updated? I'm thinking that organizations often do patch installs and something, say, overnight. Well,
Mhm,
overnight is one time on the East Coast and a different time on the West Coast. Is it
mhm.
possible if something starts to go wrong on the East Coast, it could alert people on the West Coast or vice versa before they get around to it, or
Yeah.
across the ocean?
That's a really good point. So it's actually updated every 3 to 5 minutes. So it's
Wow.
that quick. So we're getting data from all these endpoints as they're making changes. We're processing that through. So every 3 to 5 minutes, there's a change to that confidence score, or it's refreshed every 3 to 5 minutes.
And let's go back to the bigger picture of what we talked about at the very top, and that's the idea of automation.
Mhm,
Automation is something that just doesn't happen to a process, but it's something that happens to people's work. The
mhm.
security operations center staff or the cybersecurity staff, and talk about what the benefits are to those people once this kind of endpoint management automation starts to come in.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of times how automation is perceived, or even AI, is it's replacing humans' jobs. And I don't think that's quite true. I think what it's replacing is the kind of repetitive tasks that we all have to do that take up a lot of time and not actually creating time and space for the tasks that we want to be doing. And even within automation, there's always, especially if you think about organizations that are really, at scale, they're always going to need a human in the loop in that process. At some point, there's got to be a human level of validation for certain things. There's no way you're going to let, AI or even automation say, yeah, go fix all of these things and do it all at once across my organization of 150,000 endpoints. That's just not going to happen. What may happen is help me gather all of the data and pieces to actually, remediate all these endpoints and tell me what those steps are, and then help me figure out what a test plan looks like for that. And then the human can go through kind of a human validation process of, yes, this is what I want to do, or here's how I want to change that plan and actually apply it to my organization.
And we have been talking about artificial intelligence, kind of throwing that word around. And it's fundamentally different, though, in data analytics, and especially in this application, than just other analytical programs that are not AI, but simply a lot of logic, just to put it simply. So maybe talk about how you're using AI in this automation and analysis of endpoint data.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Is one thing I want to clarify is I don't think you need to apply AI just if if we can just do it with simple data analytics, right? So we're doing kind of a crawl, walk, run approach here with a lot of the data collection is looking at this data and then maturing this over time into different models that make the most sense, and especially as also models get better and better over time. One place that we are focusing and really leveraging AI is the ability to actually just interact with your endpoints and ask questions and gather data. So historically, if you wanted to know anything about your enterprise, it required complex queries, structured queries to say, I want this data. I want to understand, what machines haven't been patched, what machines have these vulnerabilities open. That required you to learn fancy query languages even when you're doing threat hunting. So we're trying to simplify that as much as we can so that you can just use natural language and say, hey, tell me the details or help me build a report that looks like this or help me summarize this report and what's critical in this report. And then what should I do about that report? So those are the types of things that we're really focusing on our AI efforts on today. And then additionally, we're expanding it to maybe you have no idea how to create an automation, right? There's a lot of people that are, we talk about automations with the assumption that people will know how to do those automations. And frankly, sometimes that's not even the case. We've built a really simple tool to use to build automations, but if you have no idea how I even automate a task, it doesn't really help you. So we're also building kind of where you can just in natural language tell us what is your use case? What is it that you're trying to automate? Maybe what you're trying to automate is you want to look at endpoints that have X, Y, and Z, and then you want to apply some sort of fix to them. So just telling us your use case and starting a draft of what this automation could look like so you can go in and tinker and tweak it so at least you have a starting place for it.
Right. So you could use natural language even to generate a report that might be a little difficult otherwise. For example, I'm just making this up, but suppose an agency has 3,000 iPhones or
Mhm.
10,000 iPhones, and you could ask it how many have 16.0.5.7 revision 1 on it, for
Yeah,
example.
exactly. Right. Right now, a lot of organizations care about who's still running Windows 10. Everyone's moving over to Windows 11. So in just natural language and say, hey, how many endpoints still have Windows 10 on it? And they'll just generate a report for you. And that report and that data in that report is coming from the endpoints in real time, right? So that's not data that's coming from a database or anything. You're actually interacting with your endpoints in real time using that natural language.
And I guess if you're really worried, you could ask it how many still have Windows 95.
Or XP. Yeah, you're right.
Right. Windows 286 is when I got started on it. Well, then what's the best route to get started? Suppose you want to up your game right now as an organization in which crucial idea of endpoint management, which maybe is the foundation for cybersecurity. What, how do you get started?
I think the best place to get started first and foremost is like visibility. Like, do you know what you have on your endpoints and what do you have on your network? More importantly, and what do those endpoints are? What are they running? And then from there, figuring out how do you mature that, right? So what you may find is, hey, I have a large amount of endpoints, like we were talking about, that are still running an older version of an OS. So how do I get those to be the latest version of OS? So and then maybe there's a large number of endpoints that have never been patched. How do I get those patched really quickly? How do I get them applications that are the most current? The really basic tasks are, I think, the most important things that you can do as an organization. And then, what are other measures of security tools and boundaries and parameters that you want to put in place?
And just finally, the ability to have this level of analysis and the AI application visibility probably makes it easier to maintain a garden variety of types of devices, each producing their own data types, because now we have the power to handle it.
Right, right, exactly. So, before you had a different way to manage your workstations, so you had a different way to manage your servers, you had a different place and way to manage your Macs and Linux, etc. Now you can kind of consolidate all of that into one place. Because really, at the end of the day, what are you hoping to do is minimize your risk as an organization, right? And making sure that you're providing tools to your organizations to do the job they're, supposed to do.
And people can feel secure that their endpoint data, say, being monitored by Atanium, they are secure, even though you're using that data from one organization, aggregating it, and sharing the combined learnings throughout your ecosystem.
Correct, and that's completely anonymous, it's not attributable. Really, all we care about is how is a Windows 10 box, when this change is applied, what is the consequences and impact of that? We don't care if that came from one organization or the other organization. We're really looking at the combined learnings so that we can help other organizations make decisions.
And it sounds like there could be a generative AI tail to all of this to kind of read back to us what it is we've been doing in our analysis over these past months or years.
Right, exactly. And what it is that we've been doing, how can we do it better? And right, so and also having feedback from operators that are applying these changes, getting feedback from end users that are obviously being impacted by these changes, all fed into it to help you make decisions for sure.
Well, thank you so much for some great insight. I want to thank today's guests. Harman Carr is the Vice President of Artificial Intelligence at Tanium. Great having you with us.
Thank you so much.
I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Tanium.